Hello everybody, welcome to our next video here on kinetics. So in recent classes we've been starting to talk about how molecules need to collide in order to react, and we talked about the ideas of molecularity, and so collisions play obviously a key role in the process of reaction mechanisms. So what we're going to start to do in this video is explore this collision event in a little bit more detail. And along the way we're going to talk about some factors that affect rate, like temperature, activation energy, and some other things. We're going to begin to see how we could quantify those influences. So you can see here on the stage I have a reaction coordinate diagram, a simple one where reactants go and form products. And I've included some of the information that we've talked about in previous videos that can be included. Namely, we have an activation energy, and I'm showing here a spontaneous reaction. We've got a negative delta G. So what I want to explore with you a little bit is what role this activation energy is playing in the reaction. Again, we know that molecules have to collide, and it turns out that molecules have to collide hard enough so that they have enough activation energy to sort of float over, to walk over the activation energy barrier. And we also know that temperature plays an effect here. If I had hot molecules, they would collide harder. They would have more kinetic energy to rise over the hill. So let's start tying together the idea of temperature with the effective activation energy. Now, one key point, and students often seem to miss this idea. A reaction is going to have a particular activation energy. Any reaction has one activation energy. If you change the temperature, you don't change the activation energy. The activation energy essentially is a property of a given reaction. Now, there are ways to manipulate the activation energy using a catalyst, and we'll talk about that later. But fundamentally, activation energy is an inherent property of the reaction you're trying to do. So keep that in mind. Activation energy isn't really a variable here. We're going to be working with other variables around activation energy, but not activation energy itself. So keep this diagram in mind, all right? Keep the ideas of this diagram in mind, that we have an activation energy, an activation barrier we have to get over for the reaction to work. So I'm going to shrink this guy down, and I'm going to bring in a diagram you have seen before. This guy here. You've seen this before. You saw this in sophomore chemistry when you were talking about the kinetic molecular theory. For example, all the oxygen molecules that are surrounding me right now, they don't all have exactly the same identical kinetic energy. Some have, a fairly average amount of kinetic energy. Some have less, some have more. This distribution almost looks like a bell curve, but it does have sort of a tailing effect on the upper ends of kinetic energy. So with all these molecules bouncing around and smacking into each other, it turns out that only a fraction of them are going to have enough energy to get over our activation energy barrier for any reaction. So we can place on our energy axis of this diagram here, I can place an approximation for the activation energy. I'm just going to say, assume that my activation energy for some reaction I'm interested in is about that much. So there's our activation energy. And I'm going to extend that line up for a particular purpose. Hopefully that's a fairly straight line going up. So then the question is, of all the molecules that are bouncing around in my sample that's trying to react, how many of these particles are actually able to get over the barrier? Well, any set of molecules that has the activation energy or higher is going to be able to get over the barrier. So in this case, and I'll shade it in a little bit, this fraction of molecules here has enough activation energy to get over the hill. And what is that, like, I don't know, maybe 20% of the molecules based on my quick little sketch here? So only about 1 in 5 molecules can actually overcome this activation barrier we have up here, right? So, and that is at a particular temperature. I'm going to call this temperature, let's call it T1. Okay, at some temperature T1, only about 20% of the molecules can get over the hill. Now we know that if you increase the temperature on a reaction, it goes faster. Why do reactions go faster at higher temperature? Again, it's not because we're doing anything to the activation energy. That is what it is. What happens at a higher temperature, and I'll do this in a different color, let's see, I'll do this in green. At a higher temperature, the distribution of kinetic energies gets altered. The distribution flattens out but extends out as well, and I'm starting to go off my own chart there. And so at a higher temperature, let's call this T2, you can see that you have a greater fraction of molecules that can overcome the activation barrier. Here it looks like I drew about 50%. So at a higher temperature, reactions go faster because you have molecules, a greater fraction of them, banging into each other with enough energy to get over the barrier. That's why temperature makes reactions go faster. And there's a way to quantify this effect. Through a branch of science called statistical mechanics, we could actually do a theoretical calculation that tells us, based on a given temperature and a given molecule type, what fraction of those molecules could get over the hill, and therefore that could tell us, based on sort of a statistical analysis, how fast the reaction should be. And when you do that calculation, every single time you do that calculation, you do it 100% correctly, you're going to get a rate, a theoretical rate. But every single time you do that calculation based on temperature and the types of molecules and the activation energy, turns out the rate you predict, you theoretically calculate, is always too big. It always comes out to be faster than what's actually observed in the lab. So there must be some other factors that this statistical mechanical analysis isn't quite getting at. And that's going to bring me to my next little topic here I have in the margin, and that is expo markers, believe it or not. Expo markers, like these two guys here, are going to help me explain this other factor. So let's pretend that our expo markers are molecules. Now I know we've been pretending tennis balls are molecules, but let's for a moment pretend that expo markers can be molecules. And here's one reagent, here's the other reagent, and my product looks like this. Here's my product, okay? So, you can hopefully see where this is going. My two molecules can bang into each other. Maybe at some temperature they're banging into each other somewhat lightly, or they can smack really hard into each other at a higher temperature. Now I can get these guys to bang into each other all day long, but in order to form product, they have to bang into each other in just the right way, namely like that, in order to form product. So I have another factor here that's influencing the rate. Not only do the molecules need to hit each other, that's requirement number one, they need to hit each other hard enough, requirement number two, and they also have to hit each other in just the right way, requirement number three. And the word we're going to use for that third requirement is going to be orientation. Now, if your molecules are spherical like tennis balls, the orientation issue isn't such a big deal because spheres are very highly symmetrical. So just about every collision has a chance of being productive. But if your molecules have lower symmetry, like an expo marker, then they have to collide with one another in somewhat more particular ways. So this orientation factor can be connected to the symmetry of the molecules. So let's summarize a little bit about the different factors we have identified so far that affect rate. And we've begun to see how many of these can be quantified. Admittedly, other than this first one we're going to mention, we haven't really quantified all the others. What's the one factor that we have overtly accounted for in a quantitative way in our reaction rates? That one factor we've done so far, think about the differential rate law, the first rate law we examined in class. Well, that one factor is, hopefully you've thought of it, is concentration, right? We've quantified concentration. You get that in the order of any given reactant in the rate law. So is it 0 first or second order? That will tell you how that concentration influences the rate. Now, we've also alluded to a few other things. Okay? We've talked about activation energy, right? The higher the hill, the slower the reaction. We know that qualitative connection, but we haven't quantified it yet, and we'll get there. We also know that temperature effects rate, and we've sort of shown how we can quantify that with the analysis over here with our activation energy barrier and the distribution of kinetic energies of the molecule. So if you take this chart and combine them together, you can begin to see how we could quantify the temperature effect. We're going to get to that real soon. And then in this video here, the issue I highlighted was, was the idea of orientation as being another factor. And I talked about symmetry. Higher symmetry is going to have maybe less of an orientation issue, and lower symmetry molecules will have a bigger issue with symmetry. So these three guys that I'm putting in this box there are the ones that we haven't truly quantified. We've alluded to how we're going to quantify them, but we haven't actually truly quantified them. We're going to do that in the next video.